Hybrid warfare is one of those topics that are talked about a lot, but are hard to define. It's a fairly new term, but at the same time, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what about it that is new. After all, people have been using dirty tricks in war since the beginning of time. So what's the fuzz? But in this video, I want to make it clear what hybrid warfare is, or at least I'm going to give the best answer that I have found. And I think it turns hybrid warfare into a much more practical concept to work with. Hybrid warfare means to wage war below the threshold of actual war fighting. So it's things like subversion, enticing uprisings, election meddling, misinformation, and so forth. The most famous example is probably Russia's occupation of Crimea in the beginning of 2014. What happened was that the so-called little green men took over the peninsula without anyone really noticing what was going on before it was all over. Other examples that are often mentioned as hybrid warfare are the Russian meddling in the American presidential election in 2016 and the Brexit referendum. Here they managed to manipulate social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter, and they did it in a way that deepened the social fault lines in the American British societies. And this helped to radicalize the different political positions, and ultimately it can have moved the needle in the voting. Lately, there has been a lot of talk about refugees being weaponized in hybrid warfare operations, for example, by Belarus. And that's just a disgusting way to capitalize on human suffering. Hybrid warfare has often been connected to Russia. And I think that's because Russia had so much success with it in Ukraine. That was when we really started noticing how great military results can actually be achieved with these measures. But I don't want to make it sound as if Russia is the only ones doing this. Many countries have engaged in things that can be termed hybrid warfare. The problem when we talk about hybrid warfare is that this is not really a new thing. As long as humans have been fighting, we have been using dirty tricks. And as a concept in military thinking, it's not really new either. Like, for example, the American diplomat George Kennan wrote a famous telegram in 1946 where he described how the Soviet Union saw the world after the Second World War. And here he described what he termed Soviet policies on a subterranean plane. And that's basically hybrid warfare. The concept is also easy to recognize in ideas like the Soviet concept of reflexive control. So hybrid warfare is not really a new thing, and many people have criticized it for being a fancy buzzword that doesn't really have any meaning. And as these critics point out, no war in history has ever been fought without the use of hybrid tactics. It has also been suggested that other terms like political war or gray zone conflict may better express what's going on. And I think we can argue about these terms and what we want to call this phenomenon. I don't have a problem with the term hybrid warfare. It seems to be the term that most people use, and I'm happy to use it too. But we just need to be aware that other people may use different words for basically the same thing. And my take on it is that there is something new about hybrid warfare. With modern technology, we can coordinate much more effectively between the different instruments of national power. So there is something different about the scale compared to earlier. But at the very least, the theory about hybrid warfare is new. There is something here that we don't quite understand, and there are many discussions about what it means. So even if we think that hybrid warfare is an old concept, it's still relevant to think about it. And I think one of the most interesting theories is David Kilcullen's theory about liminal warfare. He introduced this theory in an article in the Scandinavian Journal of Military Studies, and he later expanded on it in his book, The Dragons and the Snakes. The article is free, so I'm going to add a link to it in the video description. So liminal warfare is yet another term for hybrid warfare, but Kilcullen prefers to talk about the liminal aspect rather than the hybrid one. But it basically covers the same thing. Kilcullen's point is that the interesting thing is not so much that different tools are combined in a hybrid fashion, but rather that they are used in ways that take advantage of certain thresholds in the opponent's defensive systems. So the thresholds are the central element in Kilcullen's theory. The first one is a detection threshold. So this is the moment when the opponent notices that something is going on. Before the detection threshold, the operation was invisible. This is what Kilcullen calls the area for clandestine activities, where you can conduct operations that nobody has a clue about. But above the detection threshold, it is recognized that something is happening, and the opponent will start to investigate what it is. But even though they know that there is an operation going on, they still don't know who's behind it. So this is the area of covert operations, where the operation is detected, but the sponsor is unknown. This is the case until the next threshold, which is the attribution threshold. At this point, the opponent knows that there is an operation, and they also know who's doing it, or at least they have a fairly good idea about who is doing it. But there may still be confusion, and there can be ambiguity that can be exploited. For example, data can be interpreted in different ways, and politicians can have doubts about how to respond. So that's the last threshold, the response threshold. This is the moment when the opponent's politicians decide how to respond to the operation. At this point, when you reach the response threshold, the hybrid operation is over, and instead we have an open conflict. So the goal is to spend as much time as possible below the response threshold. Not necessarily below the other thresholds, because not all operations have to be clandestine. But you want to be below the response threshold so the operation isn't interrupted. And sometimes that's enough, and you never actually get to the open conflict. For example, if we take the meddling in the Brexit referendum, we pretty much know what happened. And we also know that Russia did it. But by the time we got anywhere near the response threshold, it was already over. Kilcullen refers to this as the temporal dimension to liminal maneuver. The point is that almost everything will become known eventually, so you don't need to keep the secret forever. You just need things to be ambiguous until it is too late to respond. At other times, you know that the operation will eventually turn into an open conflict, so you take advantage of the subliminal period to shape the conditions for the open conflict. And then when your opponent gets to the response threshold, you move quickly and you move with overwhelming force. And this can create a fait accompli like the one we saw in Crimea in 2014. So at this point, you'll often want to get back into the ambiguous zone. For example, you could engage in peace negotiations or show good faith. And this will allow you to sort of consolidate your gains. And if your opponent tries to sort of reestablish the previous order, then they will get the blame for violating a ceasefire. The interesting thing about Kilcullen's theory is not that some operations are clandestine and that others are overt. That's an old distinction. The new thing is that Kilcullen identifies a room for maneuver between the clandestine and the overt, and that's what he calls the liminal zone. And I think this creates a useful framework for talking about hybrid warfare, where it becomes much more tangible. The last thing I want to touch on is the question of what determines the location of the thresholds, because they're not static. They can move, and for different actors, they can be higher or lower. And the first two thresholds, the detection threshold and the attribution threshold, are determined by ISR capabilities. So that is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So they're largely technical in nature, you can say. And the better ISR you have, the lower these two thresholds will be. The response threshold, however, is determined by political factors mostly. So democratic societies tend to have a higher response threshold because there are more checks and balances in the system, and politicians have to create consensus before they can respond. And this is a vulnerability for democracies because opponents can take advantage of the time it takes to reach a decision. However, as Kilcullen points out, there are actually 5 processes in responding to a hybrid attack. Like the first 3 are these thresholds, but after you decide to respond, you also have to mount and then to launch a counter operation. And the time requirement for these last 2 phases are determined by military factors like readiness and deployment speed, and whether you already have assets in the area and how long they can survive in the action. So actually 4 out of the 5 phases depend on the capabilities of the intelligence system and the military, and only 1 depends on the political system. So democracies can leverage the slightly longer political response time by having good intelligence systems and militaries that are ready for the task. So that's Kilcullen's theory about liminal warfare. I will probably still call it hybrid warfare because that is just the term that most people use. But I think it's a very practical description of what hybrid warfare is because it gives some specific and measurable thresholds that are easy to apply when we talk about hybrid warfare or hybrid operations. So I hope you found that useful to hear about Kilcullen's ideas about liminal warfare. And with that, I'm going to end it here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.